witchcraft in deep, rural Russia, an odyssey of folklore and magic, a deceptively complex card game, a dark, sinister story with branching paths, and the running theme of the perils of letting those who know better decide what's best for those who know less. These are some of the things that you can expect to find in Black Book, and I am here to tell you all about it. Привет, my druzhya. Welcome to another episode of
The Old Gamer Recommends and Reviews.
And today we're going to be talking about Black Book, a title that we have already covered here on the channel. I talked about it fairly extensively on that Card Battler Tier Maker video, and I also showed it to some of you over on Card Battler Saturday. And I am here yet again after finally watching the credits roll, and after sinking a few hours into the endless battle mode to finally do it justice. I'll start by saying a little something to those of you who deliberately skip my Card Battler videos. This is an RPG, goddammit. And it should be the first label on this list, not the last one, because it's better at RPGing than 90% of the RPGs out there. Now that that's out of the way, let's talk about character creation and character progression in this game. You don't create your character in Black Book. You play as Vasilisa, a Russian peasant girl who's been blessed, or cursed, depending on how you look at it, with the gift of magic. And you take the reins of this character shortly after she's suffered the loss of her betrothed, and after a very long and not particularly succinct conversation that takes place at the beginning of the game between Vasilisa and her grandfather Yegor, you gather that she is all dead set on using her magical talents to undo the death of her betrothed, and that her grandfather Yegor is willing to serve as her guide. But bringing back someone from the dead is no trifling matter. This isn't something that can be done by means of a one-time demonic ritual. Vasilisa possesses a black book, hence the name of the game, of strange origin, that has the power to make it happen, but she must first break its 7 mystical seals. And it just so happens that these seals can only be broken by different supernatural demonic entities. So she embarks upon the adventure to find and convince, or negotiate, or coerce these demonic entities into breaking the seals. Vasilisa's journey takes her from one confine of western rural Russia to another, and even to several unearthly mystical places as she presses on in pursuit of her wish. And over the course of her travels, she visits a series of villages and towns where she meets some people who claim that their loved ones, their homes, and often even themselves, have been cursed or affected by other demonic activity, and these strange occurrences tend to be the beginning of a thread of dark events and brushes with the occult that Vasilisa pulls until she stands before the next big supernatural demonic entity that has the power to break the next seal of the book. As for the character progression aspect of the game itself, your mission as a player is to decide what kind of witch you want Vasilisa to be. What kind of person even? Are you going to be a self-serving individual who only cares about people's woes and worries when helping them gets you closer to your own goals? Are you going to play the demon's games to further advance your own plans? Or are you going to use your gift to help people without expecting anything in return? All of these options are on the table most of the times, and going down one path or the other has short, mid, and long-term consequences. And while the character progression system does not have an impact on every aspect of Black Book's gameplay mix, it does give you a say on 2 of the most important things: combat and, chort management. Combat is basically the most important thing in the game, and chort management has a huge impact on the whole deciding what kind of witch you want to be deal. Black Book uses an experience point-based system, and you have talent trees with skills that you can allocate points to every time you level. Some of these skills will help you manage your chorts, while others will make you more powerful in combat. Some can even help you financially, which is interesting, because money is an important resource in this game, because consumables and equipment are expensive, but they can make a very big difference in combat. Speaking of items, I wasn't expecting itemization to be so good in this title. The items that you equip on Vasilisa don't have a gazillion stats along the lines of plus X damage or plus Y defense. They usually do something that serves to make your strategy stronger. For example, I had this all-white deck that was all about making my defense outpace the enemy's attacks and preventing all incoming harmful effects. This deck essentially turned Vasilisa into a block-based ironclad that could use block as an offensive argument as well. The deck's main weakness, however, was that during the early stages of a fight, in those combat encounters in which enemies tried to ram me as quickly as possible, I could have trouble negating damage. So I equipped a series of trinkets and amulets that would help me build a lot of defense really quickly. But you also have items that have multiplier effects on some of the game's card effects, turning them into very interesting tactical assets. The same thing can be said about herbs. Herbs work like potions in Black Book. Some are your standard health or block restoration potions, but many have interesting effects like stripping the enemy of all of its block or preventing the next incoming negative status. So if you have deep pockets and trinkets that increase the amount of herbs that you can use per turn, herbs have the potential to work as consistent battle assets for Vasilisa. Also, managing your chort is a bit of a pain in the ass, and as game mechanics, it might feel a little bit detached from the rest of the experience. But at some point you are likely going to realize that handling your chorts adequately is the key to achieving some of the game's most desirable outcomes, and the game does provide you with various tools to make the most out of this unpleasant task. I really wish Black Book's character progression mechanics had a bit more impact on other aspects of the gameplay, such as questing, exploration, or puzzle solving. It would have been cool to have some skill-dependent dialogue choices in some conversations, impactful ones at that. Or maybe some form of perception skill that you could use to detect hidden rooms in some of the game's locations, or special clues to make Vasilisa's detective work a little bit more, detective-y. But we'll talk more about that later. As it is, the game's character progression system allows you to come up with your own strategies and to put together proper tactics to approach the combat aspect of the game pretty much however you wish, and it also gives you ample opportunity to be the witch that you want to be in the world. Like we said, Black Book does not allow you to create your character, and when a game does that, you can only hope that the character that you get to play as is as interesting as Geralt or Harry Dubois. And despite the game's atrocious voice acting and a few less than stellar dialogue lines, Vasilisa is an interesting character. She has believable goals, a believable motivation, and more importantly, she can potentially have a very interesting character arc, and she can end up being a very different person at the end of the game. And the best part is that this last thing depends on the decisions you make over the course of the game. Gameplay. Black Book's gameplay mix is very interesting. Three of its most important aspects are combat, questing, and chort management. Combat is card-based and it features mechanics that are pretty original, but at the same time easy to grasp. Also, the game's theme and its premise are seamlessly woven into them, which makes them feel right and fun to play. Also, the cards have lore-consistent names and effects. As a card battler, it isn't very challenging at first or ever, but some combat encounters further down the line might give you pause. The game is particularly good at progressively introducing new mechanics, card effects, and enemies. At first, you only have to wrap your head around a couple of effects and mechanics, but every time you open a seal, a new family of Zagavors becomes available, and that usually entails more complex mechanics with which you can build more interesting synergies. And usually, many of the enemies that you get to face after you've broken a seal will challenge you to use these new skills and mechanics, and this keeps things interesting and fresh all the way through. At first I was crushing demons left and right, including bosses, but at some point I found myself quitting some fights halfway through, going back to the drawing board so to speak, and putting together a new deck that would undo the enemy's plan. And all of this is great. You get to choose 1 out of 3 card rewards every time you beat a combat encounter, but you can also purchase cards from vendors at the local town fair, and you can build different decks and keep them ready for the different combat encounters. There are also puzzle combat encounters, which work pretty much like your Gwent puzzles in Thronebreaker. You get a fixed deck and a fixed number of turns, and you have to figure out how to use the cards you are given to sort out the situation. And this is a nice variant. These puzzles are not frequent enough to become annoying, and not scarce enough to feel random or like an afterthought. But though combat is the most important aspect of the game, questing is where this game truly shines in my opinion. Vasilisa visits many villages and towns over the course of the game, and many of the villagers require Vasilisa's help with matters pertaining to dark, occult, and mysterious. Their requests usually entail multi-step quests that involve many locations, NPCs, detective work, and a lot of folklore. Most quests require Vasilisa to undo a curse and to figure out who's the culprit, and figuring out how to get rid of the problem usually requires extensive knowledge of witchcraft and folklore. Many of these quests strongly remind me of some of the contracts and missions in the Witcher series. You even have some of the same monsters. One quest in particular is very similar to the Hein quest that you do in Skellige in The Witcher 3. And the game does not fuck around with its lore. The locations in which the game takes place are real, and the monsters and curses and the way in which you have to deal with them are completely based on Russian folklore. I especially like how the game handles its journal entries. Conversations and narrations in Black Book are written in a way that will inevitably pique your curiosity and make you look for further context by reading these journal entries. And oftentimes the best solution to a demonic conundrum lies in choosing the correct answer out of the options available during a conversation. And of course, you'll only know what the right answer is if you have been paying attention and reading the journal entries. Many of the decisions you make during these dialogue sequences have massive consequences further down the line. Some decisions can even lock you out of some outcomes. At the end of the game, you get a final Fallout-style succession of narrated stills that reveals what became of the people you met along the way, and the world itself as a consequence of your actions. Those of you who are looking for a proper detective experience should know that, while there is some detective work to be done in Black Book, piecing together clues and coming up with plausible explanations based on the evidence collected is not what the game is about. A lot of the mysteries in these games are solved by simply following breadcrumbs from clue A to clue B, which means that Vasilisa will do most of the work by herself. One thing I like about the quests in Black Book is that none of them are run-of-the-mill fetch quests. They are all mini-stories with climactic moments and satisfying conclusions. And I like that there are few quests that you could consider side quests. There is mandatory and non-mandatory stuff, but everything seems to come together into one big main story, and all of it is relevant. The game also features puzzle solving, and for the most part I enjoyed this aspect of the game. They are not difficult enough to give you pause and distract you from the stuff that you actually pay the price of the admission for, and every time you run into one of them, it feels like the right type of challenge given the situation. Except this puzzle, which was directly copied from Knights of the Old Republic and makes absolutely no sense here. You also have chort management in Black Book. I didn't enjoy this aspect of the game at all, but I find the concept very interesting. Over the course of the game, Vasilisa defeats a series of demons that become her personal chorts for the remainder of the adventure. And she needs to keep these demons occupied by sending them out on errands. The problem is that these errands are evil deeds, sins that add to Vasilisa's evil record. But if you don't send the demons out to pester some of the people living in nearby villages, they pester Vasilisa instead, adding some nasty debuffs to her that diminish her combat capabilities. Sending too many demons out saves you from suffering these negative effects, but it may also have far-reaching, very negative consequences. And trust me when I tell you that you will be judged for your sins in this game. You can deal with this in many interesting ways, but I will let you figure out those by yourself. Now, if you look at it from a certain perspective, there is also an interesting subtext to this whole chort business. It's a comment, if you will, about how not keeping your personal demons in check and letting them affect those around you will surely come back to bite you in the ass as well. When the game fires on all cylinders, it truly is the whole package. Nice combat, thrilling stakes, immersive storylines, player agency, and even a touch of spookiness. but the writing is a little bit dense and reiterative at times, and as a consequence the pace suffers a little bit. This is especially true at the end of every chapter, which usually happens right after you've broken one of the seals. When that happens, you almost always go back to your grandfather's house to tell him what transpired, and these conversations are, by far, the most boring moments in the game. For me, they usually marked the end of the gaming session for the night. But the truth is that the game has many more exciting moments than boring ones, and the gameplay mix is one of the most rewarding that I've come across this year. Story and lore. I have played quite a few games recently whose stories feel like sophisticated buildings that could have been designed by Zaha Hadid herself, with apartments that could have been decorated by Asmongold, and Black Book feels like one of those. And what I mean by this is that the story itself is solid. The main character follows Campbell's hero's journey for the most part. It's structured in 3 acts, the first of which introduces the main character, its goals, motivations, and purpose, and from then on out the stakes get higher until the main character reaches a point of no return. And then you get a proper rising action with a satisfying climax. The problem is in how the narration achieves all of these things. Dialogue and narration in Black Book aren't what I would call stellar. They feel as though the writers didn't completely trust their own talents for metaphor and world building, or their audience's capacity to piece together what was going on. So they over-explained stuff a little too much and neglected the golden rule of show don't tell a little too often. It's a bit like this piece of shit film that I watched just yesterday.
Somehow it feels natural to find a daughter of mine on a different island. A family seems exactly like an archipelago, all part of the same whole, but still separate and alone.
Gee, thank you, George Clooney, for completely explaining a metaphor that I should have been able to pick all by myself. Internal monologue in this film is often used as a way to explain stuff that should have been coded as subtext or shown through imagery. And that's how I feel about some of the conversations in Black Book, particularly the ones that Vasilisa has with her grandfather at the end of every chapter, and about some of her internal monologue. And there is a spectacularly bad moment near the end, in which the story breaks its own rules anime style, just because someone thought it would look cool or some shit. We definitely could have done without that moment, but fortunately it's easy to turn the page because it does not have too much of an impact. I still have to say that this game has an epic feeling to it that few other games have. It truly feels like an odyssey. I'm going to tell you about one of the many stories in the game, just one. It's a spoiler, yes,
But it's a sacrifice I am willing to make.
At some point in the game, you pursue a colossal figure that you can see far off in the distance behind a mantle of thick fog. You believe the figure to be a Leshy, a supernatural entity who can help you break the next seal of the book. But after hours of chasing him through a dark and foggy forest, the fog eventually becomes too thick and you lose track of the figure and get lost. And after many more hours of wandering about, you arrive to a strange village. A local hunter tells you that you are in the village of Nemzia. You also learn from the hunter that Nemzia is under some sort of spell. The village has been removed from the rest of the world, and it now rests in some kind of pocket dimension in an ethereal realm. You are told that there is no leaving the place, and that those who have tried to escape by venturing into the fog have found themselves back where they started in the best cases, or never gotten back at all in the worst. You also learn that this is the work of a powerful Chort, a Leshy who demands all sorts of tributes from the locals as payment for all the things he provides, namely game and crops. But the Leshy also abducts villagers from time to time, and they disappear never to be seen again. So if you want to escape Nemzia, you need to cooperate with the villagers to find out who and where the Leshy is and what has happened to the people he's abducted. Wandering about in the forest searching for clues, you meet a strange talking raven who goes by the name of Karnish. He is quite obviously a demon, and he isn't very forthcoming about his motivations, but he offers to help you with your quest, and he seems earnest in his intentions at least. In fact, he says that the Leshy has taken up the identity of one of the villagers in Nemzia, and that it is of utmost urgency that you find out who this villager is. If you decide to cooperate with Karnish, he helps you rescue one of the villagers and gather some evidence to unmask the culprit. After exploring the village and its surroundings, talking to its people, and doing some proper witchy, Batman-y detective work, with the aid of your new shady ally, you finally find a way to reveal the Leshy's identity. Turns out he's Philemon, the village shepherd. When you confront Philemon, he explains that the village needs to remain isolated, removed from the earthly plane of existence. Philemon says that he's seen the future, or interpreted some omens rather, and he knows that plague, famine, and war are coming to the region, and that the consequences of releasing Nemesia from the spell would be far worse than the disappearance of a few villagers. When asked about the missing villagers, Philemon says that he's drained their life force and used it to maintain the spell, but he still keeps them around as soulless empty husks. Philemon makes it abundantly clear that he believes to know what the villagers need better than the villagers themselves. He doesn't bother to explain to them what's coming because he believes that they wouldn't understand, and that there is a good chance that in their ignorance, if given the choice, they would ask him to release the village from the spell. Karnish the Raven is in favor of breaking the spell and letting the villagers decide their own fate, and Philemon of course wants to keep things as they are. Who will you help? Will you side with the Leshy with fascist tendencies and avoid a series of potentially lethal confrontations, and lose the Talking Raven as a potential ally for the remainder of the adventure? Or will you free the people of Nemesia and face the authoritarian Chort in deadly combat? Most quests in Black Book involve juicy plots that thicken quickly, and they usually entail moral dilemmas that aren't always cut and dry. They also usually involve a broad cast of characters that range from regular peasant folks to supernatural beings with untold magical powers, and several different locations. And the stories themselves are all based on mythology and folklore. Which takes us to the lore aspect of the game, which I think is
amazing.
And if you stay and watch the credits after you finish the game, you'll see why. These guys went through a fuck ton of literature. I kid you not, there are dozens of books on witchcraft, folk tales, mythology, history, herbs, and other topics on that list, and it shows. The character of Vasilisa, for example, seems to have been at least partially based on the main character of the folk tale, Vasilisa the Beautiful. Loosely based, that is. At one point in the game, Vasilisa visits the Spinner, a character who resembles the witch Baba Yaga as portrayed in Vasilisa the Beautiful. The witch even has a talking skull on a pike outside her hut, whose purpose is to test visitors with riddles to prove that they are worthy of an audience with the witch. And this is a scene that's been taken directly from the book. The world of Black Book feels real, and its depiction feels organic and seamless. Take Expeditions Rome for example. I love this game, and I like how they handled the lore aspect of the story. But at the end of the day, ancient Rome history and lore were used to provide context to a story that could have taken place in any other scenario with a few tweaks. Black Book feels uniquely Russian because its story and characters aren't conceivable outside the setting. Their superstitions, their mindsets, their lifestyles, all of these things are specific to the place they inhabit, and they feel like a product of its history. You have interesting details like the fact that regular folk come to your izba to ask for your help, and they always bring gifts, never money. And this is some form of tacit knowledge that everyone seems to have except city folk. People who come from larger towns and cities need to be explained how things work. Just playing the game casually will give you an idea of what wedding traditions are like in rural Russia. It'll give you an idea about what some of the local festivities are like, the role that clergymen play in society, the use of bathhouses or banyas like they call them in the game, local superstitions, and many other things. The game effectively transports you to a time and place in which people live and think in ways that have nothing to do with your own, and that's what makes them interesting. Some of the vocabulary in the English version of the game sounds a little bit off, but then again, English as a whole probably sounds out of place in this game. For that, and for another reason that we're going to be talking about later, I strongly suggest that you play the game in its original language and use the subtitles of your preference. I also don't want to end this section without talking about the final stretch of the game. I strongly believe that the final stretch of a game can make or break the title, and I think the final stretch of the game in Black Book is amazing. At some point in the game, while I was already deeply satisfied with what I was doing, I was fairly convinced that this was going to be a one and done deal. But now that I've finished it, I'm totally convinced that I am going to play the game again at some point, and that should tell you all you need to know. Companions, lore-wise. Black Book features an odd cast of companions, and they go from people who need Vasilisa's help and tag along for the ride because it's their problem that she's trying to solve, to crazy talking cats and birds that are really demons wearing animal skins. Every companion has a rich background that's deeply rooted in the game's lore. They bring relevant information to the table, there are interesting conversations to be had with many of them at your Itzba, and they have some of the very best companion quests ever in the history of gaming. And I'm not even exaggerating one bit here. Kolya's quest, for example, is amazing, to the point of being one of the highlights of the game narratively. One of these companions even saves your hide near the end of the game. Companions rescuing the main character is tight, but unfortunately I can think of very few games in which this happens. There's Dragon Age Origins, Expeditions Viking, and more recently Beyond Galaxyland, but that's about it. Guess that we can now count Black Book amongst those. I also like that your companions play a very big role in the grand scheme of things. In helping or defeating them, you advance your own personal goals and story, and this happens in a way that feels organic to the narrative. I admit that I wasn't expecting this aspect of the game to be so good. The only thing that I find a tad disappointing about your companions in Black Book is the fact that you rarely get the chance to choose which companion to bring along. Most of the times, the game makes this decision for you, and sometimes the reason seems to be that the writers were maybe a little bit too lazy to give your companion's character-specific dialogue lines tailored to the various situations that Vasilisa encounters. Overall, Black Book was a very pleasant surprise in this respect. Companions gameplay-wise. Every companion has one skill. That's it. And I think they could have done much more with your companions. I think the devs didn't see them as proper party members, and I think this sucks. I think there's a lot of opportunity for improvement here. Also, aside from Proshkas, their skills aren't even that useful. There are cards and trinkets that reduce your companion's skills' cooldown times, and that makes them a little bit more interesting tactically, but not by much. So, you can't equip your companions with gear, and they don't have different skills or talent trees. Some of them have some situation-specific talents that can make your life easier in some story-related events, but this just happens once or twice in the entire game. Overall, huge disappointments in this respect. Secondary mechanics and user experience. The more videos I make, the more I think this category should be broken up into two. Anyway, let's get into it. Secondary mechanics in Black Book are exactly what they need to be. In addition to the game's core gameplay mix of combat, questing, chore management, exploration, and puzzle solving, you have inventory management, trading, and Durac. Trading is important in this game. Money and other resources are scarce, and whether this or that herb or trinket is worth a purchase largely depends on the decks that you are building. Speaking of which, you can make and save 3 different decks, Gwent style, and switch to the one that works best depending on the situation. Though that requires a bit of save scumming, and I wish there had been a way to anticipate what the next battle was going to be like, so that you would have a better idea of which deck to take along. But I can't think of a way to implement this that wouldn't have been immersion breaking. Trading takes place at the local fair, where there are 3 vendors that you can interact with, and there's also people playing cards, and you can gamble with the locals if you wish and use your witch powers to cheat. As simple as it is, going to the fair is a pretty immersive experience. You can also play Durac with your grandfather and with some of your companions, and you can even skip the whole game and go straight to playing Durac if you wish from the main menu, which I think is super nice. There should have been a similar option for Gwent in The Witcher 3. But the best part about Durac in Black Book is that it often comes up as an alternative to combat or persuasion, which in this game boils down to choosing the right dialogue option, and I think this is great. And you also have a lot of ad hoc little mechanics, like this passage that feels as though it was taken directly from those Scarecrow passages in Batman Arkham Asylum. And I'm not complaining, most of the times these ad hoc mechanics feel like the right choice. User experience is very good when it comes to most things. Card mechanics are not what you usually expect from a card battler. The game has its own thing going on, but it's easy to figure out and the game feels good to play. One of you over on Card Battler Saturday said that you wished the game had previewed the outcome of your decisions a little bit like Monster Train does, so that you wouldn't have to do the math all the time. But I think the information is decently conveyed most of the times in this game. They don't show the details of the card's different attributes while they are in your Zagavor, so if you have doubts about what a card does, you need to remove it from your Zagavor, read the description, and then put it back in. I think they should have always shown the tooltip of what the card does, regardless of where the card was located. Also, I feel there's a bit of an inconsistency when it comes to the meaning of the word Zagavor. Sometimes the narrator says, you read a Zagavor to do this and that, which sounds like you're casting an individual spell, but during combat encounters, Zagavor refers to the array of spells that you are going to cast during that turn. Also, talking to people and interacting with things sometimes creates new journal entries, and these are usually very interesting to read, but if you don't click on the journal entry as soon as it appears, you might have some trouble locating it once the conversation is over, especially if there are more entries that you haven't read yet. I also wish you were shown a comparison between the trinkets that are for sale in a shop and the trinkets that are currently equipped on Vasilisa. As it is, you have to bring up the inventory menu, check the items that are equipped on her, and then go back to the trading interface. But these are all very minor nitpicks that don't really take away from the experience. And then you have various 3D areas in which Vasilisa can walk about freely. In these areas you can find herbs or clues about the current mystery, or you can gain access to hidden locations. This is probably the worst aspect of the game in many respects, and one of them is user experience. Vasilisa handles like a drunken rhino, and getting her to go where you want can be a pain in the ass, because some clicks are unresponsive and it's not uncommon for her to get stuck on some of the assets that are just lying about in these locations. Sometimes she even gets caught in between invisible walls. Some locations can be explored further, but you need to put her in a very specific part of the screen for the screen to pan over to that new area. Overall, secondary mechanics and user experience are pretty good in Black Book, but there are some hiccups here and there. Sound effects and mix. Well, everything has a proper sound that's consistent with its action. From the footsteps of the visitors in your izba, to the sound of coins when you purchase stuff at the shop, to the rumor of people at the fair, to combat sounds, but they are nothing to write home about really. Vasilisa and her enemies have a wide array of offensive and defensive moves, but they all sound more or less the same, and that makes it feel a little bit cheap. The mix and the production are not terrible, but they are not great by any means either. There are some notable volume issues, and sometimes there are sharp changes in the quality of the sound and the mix. Characters would go from sounding normal to sounding as though their lines were recorded in a phone booth and the clips were just plastered in an audio channel without any further mix or tweaking. Overall, while not bad, sound is not this title's strong suit. Music.
sit by a house and dissolve in a deep song.
Мелкие пташечки, и нам же с тобой, нам не лётывати, пшонку горошку, да не клёвывати, подле реку.
I think the music is fantastic in this title. It's lore consistent, theme consistent, and vibe consistent. And I especially like that most of the times, it takes the backseat, so to speak. But whenever it steps into the spotlight, it does so to emphasize the dramatic intention of a passage, and I think it does so perfectly. It's intense in combat, and adequately sad or tense depending on the situation. Also, sometimes Vasilisa arrives to a village or a town where there's a celebration of sorts going on, and that usually means that the younger peasants of the village gather together in bands to sing some folk songs. And see, these passages of Black Book remind me of Trio Mandili and of My Wife Taco, though she doesn't know we're married yet. These are three Georgian girls who walk about their town and sing folk songs, while one of them records the performance on her phone. The quality of the recording, as you might imagine, isn't stellar, and they don't sound like there's a professional choir director conducting them, because there isn't, and that's what makes these three sound like the real deal. Now, the folk tunes in Black Book are beautiful songs, to be sure. They are songs that I wanted to listen to again, and I often did. These folk songs were performed by the student choir of Perm College of Arts and Culture, and the recording is impeccable. But in my book, that works a little bit against the immersion aspect of the game. They sound a little bit too professional, too overproduced. Man, if your average peasant girls in Russia sound like this, what the hell are they doing growing crops and feeding chickens? But overall, I think Black Book's soundtrack worked perfectly as an OST for the game. Great stuff in my book. Voice acting.
The name Vasilisa seems real, as well to the ear of a demonic creature.
Howdy, Vasilisa! Thank you for not leaving me.
You can say that again.
I also want to get married and not to a wolf.
I didn't tell you to speak.
A water stream knocks the salt worker and the rusalka off their feet.
You make a lousy guest, Vasilisa. Is it what we do in the Perm region? Steal serfs from their master.
The Raven thinks that the one to blame for the missing villagers is one of them. He told me I've already met him. Who can it be? Marfa? Philemon? Yefim the hunter?
Anicia! That old witch is definitely a part of it. I will find that Leshy. I need to break the seals, not wander in the middle of nowhere.
I think I need to preface my opinion on Black Book's voice acting by saying that I should have played the game in Russian with English subtitles. I didn't do that though. I played the game in English with English subtitles. But I need to add to this little preface that if, as a developer, you are going to include X, Y, or Z language as a selectable language, then you have to put all the work that goes into it. And the guys at Morteshka didn't do that. They clearly didn't do that. Because this is, hands down, by leaps and bounds, the worst voice acting that I've ever come across in a video game. Like Asmongold says, it's not even a question. It's not even a conversation. What are we talking about here, guys? Yeah, that's how bad it is. The actress who plays Vasilisa is decent enough, and she plays both the Russian and the English version of the character. But almost everyone else is crazy bad, like insanely bad. The English cast of Black Book is to acting what Barber Butch is to diet or music. They only don't know the intonation they should give to any of their lines, but oftentimes you can clearly tell that they don't even understand what they are reading, because 80% of them can't even speak English. And then there's the voices that some of the actors put for some of the characters. And you want to know what the worst thing about this is? Well, if you look at the credits, you'll see that there are 3, not 1, not 2, but 3 voice directors. In hindsight, I should have played this game in its original language. Given the game's setting, it makes little sense to do anything else. But if you are in the habit of choosing your language, regardless of the game's origin or setting, you might want to make an exception to that policy with this game. Graphics. This is a bit of a mixed bag in my opinion. I really like the UI in this game. I love the font, I love the use of icons, except perhaps the ones they use in battle. I love the art in the cards themselves, and I love how items look in this game. That's all fantastic. It feels organic to the game, and it adds to the immersion aspect of the experience. The game features a strong, cohesive artistic vision. Locations are minimalistic in detail, but they feel adequately creepy or warm or austere or rich depending on what's needed. I like that backgrounds blur out a little bit for dialogue sequences, but you still see the movement of trees or birds, so it's all pretty decent. My biggest gripe with the game in the graphic department is the character models, and let's break this up. Human characters look pretty decent in their 2D renditions. Vasilisa and the most important characters in the game have different drawings that illustrate all their different emotions. Peasants have different attires that look rich in detail and consistent with the setting, and some even look great. Monsters, on the other hand, don't look all that great in their 2D renditions. Sometimes the narration does an amazing job of hyping up the demons and situations that Vasilisa is up against, but 8 out of 10 times, what you get is a creature that looks a lot less menacing than you expected. And sometimes they are even laughable. The Rusalka, for example, is known to toy with men's emotions to ultimately lure them to their deaths. The one in this game is a resentful, angry spirit who has been stripped of her life and mortality and forced to serve a higher being. And this is what she looks like. It's not bad, but come on. It should have looked something like this, sexy and evil, or at least with a capacity to switch gears when needed. She is of course a victim too, and Vasilisa, because she is a Koldun, can see her for what she is, but I would have liked if the artist had found a way around these contradicting traits to make it work. Also, this is Black Book's depiction of a Leshy. I'm sure there's a lore consistent reason to depict this guy like this, but every other depiction that I've seen everywhere else is more frightening and badass. But the 2D renditions of the monsters in the game aren't even all that bad in many cases. It's the 3D rendition of all character models and their animations what really undoes the feeling of danger, horror, anxiety, and gravitas that the narration so masterfully builds. There were times in this game when I was on the edge of my seat, on the verge of shitting my pants, I kid you not. And all of a sudden I was violently slapped out of my immersion by almost cartoonish cinematic cutscenes featuring laughably bad animations and unintentionally hilarious monsters and characters. And don't get me wrong, I'm just talking about 3D character models. 3D spaces, which is to say locations, are pretty good and sometimes even quite impressive all the way through. But I can't help but think that the game would have been much better off if they had completely ditched the 3D cutscenes in favor of maybe, I don't know, charcoal drawings like the ones you have in the scripted parts of Pillars of Eternity. The final stretch of the White March Part 2 is one of my favorite moments of all time in the history of video games, and all you have is charcoal drawings, text, and music. And I think Black Book would have been a killer title if they have opted for static art and text for the more cinematic bits. Overall, graphics are a bit of a hit and miss thing in Black Book, but I think the game did itself a great disservice with some of their design decisions in this department, and unfortunately, some of the worst they made had to do with some really important things. Performance and stability. Black Book is a pretty stable game, and you can play it in just about any PC. I never suffered any crashes, but I found a couple of bugs. Vasilisa got stuck every now and then in some of the 3D locations like we mentioned. Sometimes I got untranslated Russian text in some conversations, and the font size sometimes changed drastically when text bits were a little bit longer than usual. But that was about it. Overall, pretty good in this department, I would say. Other considerations and final thoughts. Black Book ticks many of the boxes of things that I look for in a game. Moreover, it ticks most of the boxes of things that I look for in an RPG. On the gameplay end of things, there is a lot of room for you to experiment with strategy and tactics, and enemies challenge your deck building capabilities as well as your skill to play your cards. And it does all of these things while still being a game that's easy to learn and fairly hard to master. Itemization adds to the strategic and tactical dimension of the game like few other titles, and there's a lot of stuff for you to do other than combat. You can play Durac with many of the game's NPCs, there's questing, exploration, puzzle solving, and this makes the game feel varied and fun to play. The story is deeply immersive, thought-provoking, and thrilling. And the way in which the game treats its lore makes the story feel grounded in verisimilitude, even if it leans very heavily into themes like magic and supernatural entities. But more importantly, it puts the player in the driver's seat of the experience by making his or her choices matter, like truly matter. It even features a Slay the Spire type of mode for those who want some form of endgame, and it's awesome. The mechanics that are specific to this mode are great, and they brought a smile to my face and made me want to come back to the game again and again. So despite all of its shortcomings, get it? Because chorts are devils in this game? No? Okay. Yeah, despite of its shortcomings, many of which have to do with fairly important things, Black Book gets a solid recommend seal of approval, as I am fairly convinced that you can't go wrong with this title if you're an RPG or a card battler guy or gal. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, thank you for watching all the way up until now. If you like what you are seeing on this channel, please consider subscribing and hitting that notification bell to avoid the typical YouTube shenanigans. Come check us out on Discord if you don't mind all the boomer talk that goes on there. I personally love it and wouldn't change it for anything. And share the video if you thought it was cool. Bye everyone.
You're excused. You can go back to playing video games.